In earlier sessions, we've talked about our motivations as helpers and the nature of grief and some of the specific interventions we can make with grieving persons and their families. In this session, I'd like to first focus on microskills, communication microskills that are useful in helping. In fact, what I'd like to try to do is to demystify the art of helping. Now, the model I work within is called a microskills model. And this is one that's been developed by Alan Ivey and Gerald Goodman and myself in my edited book, Teaching Psychological Skills, Models for Giving Psychology Away. At the heart of this is the idea that skill development proceeds in an orderly fashion, beginning with unconscious incompetence. Now, unconscious incompetence is not knowing what you don't know. If you think back, for example, in learning the skill of driving a car, you might have learned how to drive using a clutch. Well, before you tried to drive a car with a clutch, you didn't know what that really involved. You didn't know what you didn't know. Just like some helping situations, you really don't know what you don't know yet because you haven't tried to succeed in that situation. Then you got in the car and you tried to drive. And the car alerts forward and you said, gosh, this is a really complicated skill. I can't believe my parents do this so wonderfully. And then you were in a state of conscious incompetence. So that's very painful to realize what you don't know. The next stage is one of conscious competence. But here you have to think about what you're doing. Like you're driving down the road and your friend says, hey, look what's going on over there. And you say, shut up, I'm driving. Right? So you have to pay attention. You have to keep your eyes on the road, etc. Right? Finally, we move to a stage of unconscious competence. And that's where things go naturally, where the skills are hierarchically integrated and they're executed, whether it's the dancing of Fred Astaire or the golf shot of Jack Nicklaus or the helping of Mother Teresa or whatever this set of skills are, they're all coming into play in the situation as they're needed, and it's all integrated beautifully. And that's the final stage in skill acquisition. Another principle in the microskill approach is that we learn best when we learn one skill at a time. So it's important to break things down and to identify, well, what are the different micro skills, the component skills? So we don't try to become the super helper all at once. Just suddenly, oh, I'm going to be a better helper. So you watch a helper and you try to imitate. Really what you want to do is you want to say, here's what that helper's doing. So that's part of this demystification to look at, well, what do good helpers do? And then to identify that skill, identify its presence and non-presence, and then learn how to do it. And to learn how to do it, we need to do it over and over again. There's a story that a tourist was walking in New York City and went over, just coincidentally, to Yehudi Menuhin and said, which way, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And Menuhin looked at him and said, you practice, you practice, you practice. The lesson here is we need to practice these skills. Once we've identified them and we can execute them, we need to practice them over and over again. So I would encourage you to practice the skills that we identify in this program when you're finished with the program. By practicing skills, we also personalize the skills. And I can't overemphasize this. It's important that we don't try to become obsessive imitations of the good helper. What's really most important is that your sincerity, your genuineness, your real desire to help, that these come through. And this can make up for all kinds of technical errors and mistakes you might make. If you're really communicating this caring and this concern and your genuineness, that will pull you through a lot of difficult moments when your skill usage may not be so good. So it's important to remember that that's the most important thing. And that when we practice skills, they become part of our own repertoire and they become more of us, and they start to seem less foreign and like a technique that we're applying. They really become a complete expression of us, and we become all that we can become as helpers by developing more skills. What are some of the specific microskills that can help us be more effective as helpers? I'd like to focus on two kinds of microskills. The first are attending skills or nonverbal skills, and the second are verbal communication skills. Attending skills are the things that we do nonverbally that communicate our caring, concern, and they have a tremendous impact on the people we're helping. I have a nice acronym for this. It's SOLVER, solver. and I'll fill out the acronym for you. S stands for squarely facing. This means that when we're talking to the people we're helping, to squarely face them and not to be seated looking off to the side. So this gives us more contact. O stands for open posture. So it means rather than being like this, unconsciously kind of closing ourselves off, it means to be more open, to look open. L stands for leaning forward. So we look interested. And I submit to you, if you look interested, the people you're talking to are going to become much more interesting. If you look bored, whether you're aware of it or not, the people you're talking to are going to become very boring. It's an interactional event. V stands for verbal following. So that means stay with the topics that the other person is talking about. Don't topic jump. E stands for eye contact, and this is just normal, human, warm eye contact, not a fixed, paranoid stare. R stands for relaxed posture. So don't fidget with things and hold a pencil and do various things that are annoying. I know I tend to twirl my hair sometimes unconsciously, and that can be very distracting. So the whole acronym together is SOLVER. Now, there are also other things that we do that encourage the person to continue talking. These are called minimal encouragers, things that keep the other person talking, like okay, or saying right, yeah, tell me more, which are verbal, but still just have the sole function of helping the other person continue to talk and to encourage them. Now, I'd like to focus on 5 different communication microskills. First is silence. Second is, I consider this one, paraphrases and summarizations, because a summarization is a big paraphrase. Third is reflecting feelings. Fourth is self-disclosures. And the fifth is questions. So turning our attention to silence first. This is a very important skill, one that we often don't think about. In our culture, between the time one person stops talking and the other person starts talking, there's usually about 3/4 of a second that elapses. And what is that 3/4 of a second usually followed by? Either a closed question or advice. In other words, in less than 3/4 of a second, I'm going to give you an answer to your problem that you've probably been working on for at least 6 hours or 6 days or 6 years. This is part of our culture. It's one of the ways that we actually keep ourselves from entering into more intimate kinds of interactions by having this sort of verbal roller derby or just bouncing off each other very quickly, kind of a New York subway kind of communication style. It's important to pay attention to the inter-response boundary between the time one person stops talking and the other person starts talking, or the person you're trying to help stops talking and you begin to speak. And if you give yourself an extra second, you'll find that you're able to go a little deeper in terms of your own responses to come up with a better response. You can't come up with a very good response so quickly. And if you give yourself more time, that person will feel rewarded for waiting for you to give that better response. Paraphrases are essentially giving back what the other person has shared in fresh words. It's not saying the same thing. That's parroting. Paraphrases are giving it back, and this is a very important skill, and it's one that most people don't do very well. And if we parrot, it's not going to be effective. If we paraphrase effectively, it will be. Summarizations are bringing together more of what the person shared, and summarization could refer back to earlier times that you've met with the person, but it's bringing things together, either in one helping encounter or across helping encounters. And this is a really important skill. It's especially nice when you're finishing talking with somebody to kind of say, well, here's what I have gathered, or here's what I see happening, here's my summary. And I find that's a very important communication skill. Reflection of feelings are absolutely at the core of our helping efforts. It's getting the emotional message that the person's communicating and reflecting it back. And I'm going to say a lot more about this as we go on in the series. But let's take a look at some examples of these microskills in action right now.
I was totally unprepared to accept the fact that he wasn't alive. And it took me a long time to come to terms with the reality of the fact that he wasn't in this world in a physical way anymore. And
to come to grips with the finality of that, huh?
yes, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, I remember initially thinking that that he'd still be coming home, and
I think that's what's been happening over the last year, just going through we were married almost 24 years, and going through all the good and the bad, and turning to a lot of good memories.
Yeah. You're able to go back to some of the good memories. Yeah.
And look at some of the bad ones too, and realize that,
the complete picture of who you were together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, that the space of time changes in my mind. Sometimes it seems like it's been 10 years since I've seen her and smiled at her and held her in my arms and talked to her. I miss that.
That's what you miss.
Yes.
Yeah.
And other times it seems like, well, she really hasn't been gone that long.
So the experience of time is not just linear. Sometimes it seems like a long time, sometimes it seems like a short time.
It comes in two different ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so far, the length of time has not made it any easier for me.
I mean, I felt like I had people dependent on me all the time, and I didn't have someone else that was sharing what I was doing. I mean, this was a commitment that we made to have these children, and that we would both raise them and love them and care about them. And I felt very abandoned in that. I felt like I was now the person that was responsible for these kids all of the time. There was no one else that was really behind me in what I was doing, or could give me a break and say, you're really doing a great job. And it wasn't a team effort anymore.
Yeah, it's almost like before that you didn't even realize how much of a relief he did provide.
Exactly.
Or how important he was to you and the children. It's funny, isn't it, how it's almost invisible, although you knew he was important. And also, it sounds like maybe with feeling abandoned, there was maybe, I don't know, some anger at this, and being left alone to deal with this.
I don't think I allowed myself to really get in touch with how angry some of it made me.
For me, just being with it was really hard, and still is really hard, but that's getting better.
Being with that? With
the grief.
The grief.
The fact that it just comes, and everything's okay for a while, and then something will just happen, you know?
See, it's kind of an ambivalent feeling about it. Part of you wants to really go with it and embrace it in a way and say, this is a remembrance, and another part saying, hey, that doesn't feel so good.
Yeah,
this is kind of
it's still uncomfortable, and I don't know when that changes or if that changes.
My friend and mentor, Carl Rogers, thought about empathy as a process, and this is how he described it. Described it as involving entering the perceptual world of the other and becoming thoroughly at home in it. It involves being sensitive to the changing felt meanings which flow in this other person. It means temporarily living in his or her life, moving about in it delicately without making judgments, sensing meanings of which he or she is scarcely aware. It includes communicating your sensing of his or her world as you look with fresh and unfrightened eyes at elements of which the individual is fearful. It means frequently checking with him or her as to the accuracy of your sensing and being guided by the responses you receive. To be with another in this way means that for the time being, you lay aside the views and values you hold for yourself in order to enter another world without prejudice. That's a beautiful description of this process. It's the way the Indians described it, walking in someone else's moccasins. In contemporary terms, it might be running in someone's training shoes. But the idea is to really be inside the experience of another. Now, when we're trying to capture the essence of the emotional communication of another, I think it's also important to realize that we don't want to slip into kind of playing name that affect. So it sounds like you're feeling, so it sounds like you're feeling. It's one of the reasons that Rogers stopped teaching skills, because everyone was taking a very weak imitation of his very powerful therapeutic interventions and was then turning them into these very ineffective mechanical responses. So it's important not to play name that affect. It's also important that when people are making requests for action, we respond with action, not with a feeling response. For example, if someone's seriously ill and in their bed and they say, the light's in my eye, you don't say, it sounds like the light's really bothering you. You move the blind. If they say, are you going to be around next weekend, and they make a request for information, you answer their question. You don't say, geez, you're worried about whether I'm going to be in next weekend, aren't you? But if they say, it's the nights that really get me. Being alone, I feel abandoned, I don't think anyone cares. That's a request for understanding and involvement. That's when you need to respond, to use your empathy, and to reflect those feelings that are communicated to you as a helper. I guess the moral is, don't scratch where it doesn't itch. Self-disclosures are another very important microskill for us as helpers. Now, you may say, that doesn't make sense. I thought it was the person we're helping who's supposed to be self-disclosing. But for us as helpers, self-disclosing creates a two-way intimacy. It makes you a real person. People want to know who you are. But you don't want to shift the focus to yourself. So to bring up your problems, oh yeah, I'm going through that too, oh yeah, or I went through that before. It's always important to ask yourself, whenever you're thinking about self-disclosing, who's going to benefit from this? And when you ask that question, then you can evaluate whether or not to disclose. I find that process disclosures saying, geez, I'm feeling very sad for you right now, or I'm not sure what to do in this situation, but I'm going to be here for you. It can be very, very helpful. And when we do it, I think it deepens the relationship and can make us more effective as helpers.
You know, then you start looking at a lot of things that you didn't look at before. You know, should I have done more while she was alive? Did I do enough? And that's kind of normal, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and for me,
kind of hard, yeah.
watching you, part of me says, you did everything. I want to tell you, you did everything. You were there, yet you can bring up, oh, that last night we were downstairs, or, you know, we didn't do enough. Maybe we didn't talk to the doctor about this enough. Maybe we didn't consider this alternative treatment. Maybe we should have.
Yeah, mistakes.
You have all these thoughts,
yes.
and it's really difficult to find comfort or respite from those thoughts, huh?
Right, it is.
I mean, I want to comfort you, but
No, it's hard.
you're left with those thoughts almost
Yes,
inevitably, huh?
because she went into a coma the last 2 days
Yeah.
of her life.
Yeah.
I feel like I never said goodbye to her.
Let's turn our attention to questions and then to the issue of directiveness and non-directiveness in helping. Questions are the most overused and misused of all the microskills. They create numerous problems for us as helpers. They have unintended consequences. They bring lots of emotional baggage. If you think back to when you were a child and you were coming home from school and your parents said, did you stop at the store on the way home? Did you go see Jimmy? Did you, have you, are you? This kind of interrogation, we were not thinking, geez, I really want to learn about my experience on the way home. They wanted to gather information and see what I was up to. Well, we still have these kinds of feelings when people ask us a lot of questions, and there are reasons for that. One of the reasons is that questions are a very directive style of interviewing. Now, first let's look at what are the different kinds of questions. There are closed questions. Closed questions begin with are, is, can, do, have. They're basically can be answered with yes or no response, or you can have a multiple choice. Are you cold, warm, or something in between? So you can answer with one simple response. The other kind of question is the open question, and there are two kinds here, open direct and open indirect. Open direct questions begin with how, what, could, or why. Now, how, beginning a question, gets more at process and feelings. What begins to get at content more than process and feelings. Why, on the other hand, will get you into a lot of trouble. I've never found that anyone has ever had the answer to any of my why questions, so I try to avoid them as much as possible. Open indirect questions are a nice alternative. They begin with, I'm curious, I'm wondering, I'd like to know. And this is a good way to diversify your interviewing style, to ask some questions using open, indirect questions. My general advice to you, however, is to decrease the number of questions that you use. If you're going to ask questions, don't use close questions because they tend to funnel the communication in a very focused way. They're extremely directive. But to use open questions, either direct or indirect. Now, I've said that questions are very directive. If we look at the listing of microskills from silence to paraphrases and summarizations to reflection of feeling to self-disclosure and then finally to questions, there's a continuum of control and directiveness there, with it increasing as we move toward questions. The closed question is the most directive of the microskills in that list. And what happens is that highly directive interventions lead to more negotiation by the people we're helping. They also tend to keep the ball in our court. For example, I say, is your sister coming to visit? No. Where's the conversational ball? It's back in my court. Is she going to come next week? No. Now I have to deal with that. Did she talk to your mom? No. Ball bounces back. So this very directive kind of microskill keeps the ball from ever landing in the other person's court and staying there, which is where it should be if we're going to be effective as helper. We need to have the ball in the other person's court as much time as possible. Now that doesn't mean being passive. It doesn't mean not being active. It means being actively very much involved in the conversation, but at the same time not using communication skills that are going to keep the ball in our court and also create a relationship which is more authoritarian, in which I am the expert, in which you give me the information, I'm going to process it and I'll give you an answer. You won't have the answers, so you're really setting yourself up for problems. And you've got to decide, well, why am I wanting this information? It's important to ask questions that helps the other person, the person you're helping, get more information for themselves. You can get a clear map of their situation, but it won't necessarily be helpful to them. I think it's useful to think about being directive with regard to process and non-directive with regard to content. In other words, you kind of follow the lead of the person in terms of the content, but you're directing the process. You're helping them move through an exploration of this. And you're really off in the limelight. You're not really, they're not really aware how you're doing this, but you're facilitating their exploration and their discoveries. One of my teachers once told me that he had said to the people he helped over many, many years, I can help you steer the boat, but you have to pull the oars. Now there's a beautiful response that's a little bit more advanced that I want to share with you, and I call it a client frame of reference response. And essentially what you do in this response is you take the position of the other and speak in the first person. Now, this would be, for example, someone says, I'm feeling just at my wit's end, I don't know what to do, my kid's in trouble, I'm having a real tough time, I'm worried about the money, I don't know what's going to happen. To step inside that person's shoes and to say, you know, from what you're saying, it sounds like you're feeling, I don't know what to do, and I'm not getting much help figuring this out. Whatever applies. But the idea here is that we've taken that person's point of view, we've said it in the first person, and we've also done it very tentatively, and we've also clarified that here's what I'm hearing you say, because if you just said, I'm not getting much help figuring this out, I don't know what to do, they would say, you too? So to avoid confusion, we have to preface this by introducing it. And the other thing I'd like to say is that don't overuse this response. This is a very important response, and I only use it when I'm really feeling connected with what someone's sharing with me. And when in that context, it can be very powerful. Why? Because we're perfectly mirroring what the other person is saying. We're even saying it in the same tense and the same first person way, and thus it can have a very powerful effect. So I recommend that response to you, and I recommend that we try to move away from a more directive interviewing style to a less directive, but I think more effective way of talking with the people we're helping.
I guess the thing that comes to mind most is change. I mean, phenomenal changes that occurred after Chris died. Changes for me as to who I was, what my role was, and how I was going to survive initially, the first 5 years.
So for you it was, can I go on kind of
There was
feeling, or?
Tremendous amount of hopelessness initially. Chris died 33 days after an acute leukemia diagnosis. So
I just was not spiritually centered or
Yeah.
balanced or anything, and I thought, God, this is the major time in my life when I need to be grounded and very firm in my faith or whatever I feel about life, and I just couldn't do it. And rather than judge that, important for me, don't judge it. Don't judge yourself about it. Just be with it. Don't say it's wrong or it's right or I must be a terrible person because now I can't pray, or just don't judge it. Just be with it. And I have a hard time with that.
Yes, a lot of the work has been quieting these inner voices that have come up and said, you shouldn't be, not spiritual at this point, you shouldn't be questioning this, you shouldn't be, and to struggle with those voices and say, no, just leave me alone. I have to let my experience be what it is, and be with that, and accept it and be friendly to it.
Right.
But it's not always comfortable.
No, it's not very comfortable most of the time.
Yeah. As helpers, we're always choosing what to respond to. I find it helpful to listen to themes related to how does this affect the individual? What does this mean for the individual? And with grief, it's very often the case that we can hear almost questions being asked by the person who's experienced a loss. And I think about these as grief's questions, and I want to list a few of them and discuss them. First question that I think every grieving individual asks is, why me? Why did this happen to me? It doesn't make sense. As I said earlier in the series, one's assumptive system is thrown asunder. Why did it happen to me? I've done everything I needed to do. I've lived a good life. This can't be happening to me. Why me? Another question is, why did this have to happen? Our philosophical models are challenged. Are we ants on the railroad track? These are existential questions. They can challenge our religious beliefs, or they can strengthen them. What is happening to me? I feel so different. What is this process I'm experiencing? What's happening to me? How can I go on? In the Glick study I mentioned earlier in the series, after 2 to 4 years, 24% of the widows also agreed with this statement. Deep down, I wouldn't care if I died tomorrow. We grieve for what might have been. We grieve for the future, perhaps more than for the past. How can I go on? How can I continue to live my life? Another question is, what can I do? A cascade of advice pours in on us. Friends advise us to do this, to have another child, to remarry, to find meaning in the experience. There's often a painful discrepancy between our inner experience and what others expect of us. Who will help me? Who will be there? Very frequently, I find grieving people saying, I expected this person to be there for me. He wasn't. But look who was there. I never would have predicted that. Who will be there? How am I going to get support? Who's going to help? What do I need? A kind of ambiguity envelops us in grief. We really don't know what we need. If you ask a grieving person, well, what do you need? They very frequently won't be able to answer you. Will this process ever end? And this is very scary. It seems interminable. It seems inescapable. It seems like it will never end. It's very frightening when at 13 months you feel just as bad or worse than you did at 11 months, because we have the expectation that at 1 year suddenly we'll start feeling better. Many people think they should be finished grieving at 3 months or 6 months. And when that doesn't happen, it's very distressing. And they're living this question, will this process ever end? An important question that the grieving person is asking is, who am I now? No one knows me this way. Our identities, in a way, consist of the reflections that others give back to us. Reflections of self, that significant others are like mirrors in our lives, and each reflects a different part of who we are. When we lose that mirror, that reflection of self, we've lost a part of ourself. When you lose your mother, you've lost all those memories of your childhood that you can no longer reconstruct yourself. All those perceptions, all those moments are gone. When we lose our spouse, all the ways that that person relates to us and appreciates us and cares for us, suddenly gone. No one else knows me. I'm very alone. That's that very painful aloneness that the grieving individual experiences. There's a saying, when a parent dies, we lose our past. When a spouse or sibling dies, we lose our present. When our child dies, we lose our future. Grieving is really a process of redefining the self. Who am I without the person I love? And a final question the grieving person asks is, how will my life be? If the final task of grief is to become an active agent for my own well-being, how am I going to do that? How am I going to go on? Here are some vignettes that illustrate grief's questions.
I went to a retreat up at Retiro, the Jesuit retreat house this summer, and that was one of the things I found in common with some of the people there. Is you think you're going out of your mind, and everyone else is normal, and we're crazy. But the truth is, it's very, some of the feelings, and the feelings are so strong and so intense that you don't have these before, anything to relate them to.
Yeah, what is this process?
Yeah.
What is this? What's happening to me? Is that what you feel? Yeah.
And like, is this normal? Am I just completely wacko?
I think after the initial shock of it all, it's just been hard to figure out who I am now. I'm a daughter without a father. And that was the first thought that came to me after I settled down a little bit, was, who am I now that I don't have my dad? And really, on a day-to-day basis, nothing has changed. I mean, I live here and my parents are there. I go to work. The day-to-dayness is the same, but there's that difference that's somehow hard for me to feel comfortable with. And the other thing that I remember feeling and still feel now is, like, my life hasn't changed dramatically. I still do the same things, but I feel different, and I wonder, will I ever feel the same again? And I don't know. I mean, I'm obviously not the same. I no longer have a father. And just kind of dealing with that when it comes up has been sort of difficult for me.
How can we be most helpful to people as they struggle with grief's questions? Rainer Marie Rilke, in the following passage, describes beautifully the kind of process that we want to facilitate and participate in. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to live the questions themselves like locked doors and like books that are written in a foreign language. I think if we're successful as helpers, we don't provide answers in these situations, but rather we help the grieving person patiently live grief's questions and unlock the doors within.